Japan is home. Like, but what does it mean to be home from a place that now no one lives there? None of our parents live there. We don't have relatives there. We aren't ethnically part of this country. We don't have citizenship, but we still feel more attached and more rooted in home, and at home in Japan than we do anywhere else. So, on a personal level, to start with that, like, it is something that I think about a lot. And I think about, what if I never moved back to Japan, if I never lived there again, like, how would this part of my identity change? And like, what does it mean? And how do you even explain it to people outside of Japan? So it's a thing that I think about a lot, but don't have a good solution or a good sort of response to. I think it's on the whole a positive thing, despite the occasional like bouts of, where do I belong anxiety. I think it, all the sort of glib ASIJ slogan words about being a good global citizen and, becoming empathetic and understanding other cultures and all of that. I think it's real. I really do. I really think that it makes me interested and curious about people who've grown up in all sorts of different places. And I think I hope at least that's maybe a more empathetic person in my kind of day-to-day life. And I think that's really valuable.
Welcome to the 48th episode of Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Today, our guest graduated from ASIJ in 2006. He is a historian of early modern and modern Japan with a particular interest in urban history. His primary interest is in the transformation of Japanese cities between the Tokugawa and Meiji periods, including the development of new forms of social and political organization and municipal administration, with an eye to lessons that the rest of the world might learn from one of the planet's most urbanized societies. He grew up in Kobe and Tokyo before attending Yale, where he received a bachelor's in history in 2010. After brief stints in Germany and back in Japan, he entered the PhD program in history at Harvard, from which he graduated in 2018. Today, he works as a postdoctoral research associate at Yale University and is currently working on 3 books, of which one will be released this January. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm really excited as a history nerd, having another history nerd, far more qualified one than myself on this podcast. So we'll talk a bit about history, a little bit about running. We actually, back in the day, we ran together. I think you still run. I don't. And a little bit on your love life, as well as being a TCK. Right? I like to tell people, some people say I'm a TCK, and I'm sure you can agree with this, but I'm kind of a fake TCK because my mom's Japanese. So it's like, am I really in a foreign society? Not really, right? But you are sort of the true OG TCK, right? Growing up.
I guess so, yeah.
Without any Japanese parents. So we'll get into that.
Right.
But let's start off with, what's coming up actually right around the corner as we enter 2021. You've been working on not 1, but 3 books. So what is this book coming out in January about?
Yeah, so I've got a book about it's a history book, unsurprisingly, about the city of Mito in Ibaraki Prefecture, which is about 100 kilometers northeast of Tokyo. And this is actually a project kind of unrelated to my dissertation work that I was doing for my PhD. But kind of shortly after finishing the PhD, I was approached by a group of people in Mito who are sort of running this local revitalization campaign for the city. Part of their campaign, they wanted someone to write a book on Mito's history that would kind of make it accessible to both an English-speaking audience, but also to a Japanese-speaking audience, a book that's a little less sort of academic, a little less detailed than kind of the existing books on Mito's history. Make a long story short, that's what I've been working on kind of full-time the last couple of years. It's been a nice break from my dissertation work. It's also given me a great opportunity to kind of work with some local scholars and local activists in Mito. And so the Japanese version of that book is coming out. I just heard from the editor today. It might be early February now. But anyway, either the end of January or early February. It depends how quickly I get the edits back to him before the end of the year, telling the story of how Mito played this really important, really crucial role in kind of Japan's modern transformation. but it's a story that hasn't gotten a lot of press. Most people, if they know anything about sort of the Meiji Restoration, they think about Satsuma, they think about Choshu, the great kind of Western domains that rise up and overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate. But Mito was actually a branch family of the Tokugawa shogunate. So the fact that it too played a role in overthrowing, its own family is pretty complicated. And anyway, they tend to kind of get left out of the story in a lot of popular retellings. So this book is an attempt to kind of bring their side of the story back into the picture a little bit more. I can go in a lot more detail, but that's probably already more than you want to know.
You were saying they're sort of, left out from the dialogue, in regards to their role in the transformation. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that, there are several reasons. One of them, as I said, is that they were a branch of the Tokugawa family. So there's, in addition to the shogun, the main shogunate, which is based in Edo, there are 3 branches of the Tokugawa family, one in Mito, one in what is today Nagoya, and then one in what is today Wakayama. And of course, after the Meiji Restoration, the new imperial government, who's being run by courtiers from Kyoto, but also men from Satsuma and Choshu and these other sort of historical enemies of the Tokugawa, they start writing the history, right? And so, of course, anyone who's related to the Tokugawa ends up, they're the losers. They're kind of on the wrong side of history. Their stories are sort of suppressed or left out of the picture. So that's kind of one of the reasons. Another reason is that Mito itself, so one of the reasons it's so influential is that they come up with this slogan of Son no Joi, right? Revere the emperor and expel the barbarian. Kind of that's the origins of this really powerful idea that inspires lots of samurai activists, eventually overthrow the shogunate, but also fight off the Westerners and stuff in the 1850s and 60s. But these ideas are really, really powerful and really, really controversial. And within Mito itself, they're so controversial that they end up causing a civil war. And so in 1864, the civil war breaks out in Mito, thousands of people die, the domain is totally destroyed, basically. And so by the time you actually get to the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Mito is kind of out of the picture. The leadership is either dead or executed or in prison. There's all these like factional fights going on. So they cease to be a major political role. And in the Meiji period, the kind of legacies of those factional wars are still really, really powerful, and they prevent a lot of Mito people from having an important role in the new Meiji government. So that's also a reason why, for people who focus just on 1868, Mito kind of isn't that big of a part of the picture.
It's interesting that that concept of sort of the winner writes history, but it's like quotation or whatever you call it, parentheses, like sort of, right? It's because they were sort of the mix of winners and losers there. Wow, that's fascinating about Mito. And has that taken you to Mito in regards to you actually traveling there back and forth quite frequently? Like, how many times have you had to go there for this book?
So I've been to Mito more times than I think I ever thought I would go in my life. I have to say that growing up in Tokyo, I think I changed trains in Mito once. As you may remember, I'm sort of a train buff, and I once took a seishun Hachikippu up to Tohoku and changed trains in Mito. But other than that, I'm like, why would you ever go to Mito, right? Like, what's there? Have you ever been to Mito?
I've never been to Mito, actually. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But since writing this book, I've been there probably, I think, 5 times total. I was supposed to be there again a few weeks ago, but of course, COVID has made it difficult to travel to Japan from the US. So yeah, I think maybe it's 4 or 5 times to Mito in the last 2 years.
And you mentioned samurai earlier, right? They obviously play a big role with the Meiji Restoration and whatnot. I know in your doctoral work and your work now, maybe you're not doing samurai as much. I might be wrong there, but I know in your undergrad, you did a major piece about samurai. And I was wondering, most people have heard of samurai at this point, right? People have seen that Tom Cruise movie where he's like chopping down things and whatnot. So people have some exposure to ninjas, samurais. What would you say is the most common misconception you hear by Americans or just by non-Japanese when it comes to samurai?
Yeah, I will say that I'm not, a total expert on samurai themselves, but I do think that one thing that I think a lot of Americans at least have a misconception about is that, samurai were warriors. and that they were always, in armor and dressed up to fight and prepared to do battle and all of this. And obviously on some level, that's true. They are a warrior class and they continue to be a warrior class. By the time you get, even just 50 or 60 years into the Tokugawa period, so by the 1660s, 1670s, Japan is a generation into, what's going to be 2 centuries of no warfare or no battles. And so the samurai, basically very quickly lose a lot of their fighting abilities. And by the time you get to the 19th century, they're basically bureaucrats. And a lot of them are very, very poor and have no power. And even though in the status system, they're kind of towards the top of the status hierarchy, in actual kind of socioeconomic reality, they don't, they're in debt to merchants, they are in debt to artisans, they're in debt to, townspeople, they have no real, they're kind of the objects of mockery in a lot of places. And a lot of them are very good bureaucrats and very good scholars, but they aren't really they're not like knights on shining armor or people with great military skills. And so I think that's one of the ironies or the paradoxes of the late Tokugawa period in particular, where, it's a warrior society where the warriors have they're not really very good warriors anymore. But I think that's kind of a misconception that a lot of people outside of Japan have, is that you've got all these feudal knights sitting around when Matthew Perry shows up with his black ships. It's no, they weren't knights on horseback or, with bow and arrows. They just weren't, they didn't have any real direct experience of fighting. And so we didn't have any modern armies in Japan at that point. So I think that's one thing, right?
That's intriguing. And sort of piggybacking on that topic of samurai, what would be in general, with, your students and just from your observations in regards to Japan in general or Japanese history? Let's stick with Japanese history. What would be sort of common misconceptions you've seen in that realm?
That's well, I'll pick one that is near and dear to my heart, which is, I think that people assume that the borders of Japan have been relatively fixed throughout history. And what I mean by that is that today, people describe Japan and they're like, oh, it's got 4 main islands plus a bunch of other smaller ones. And they sort of don't appreciate or don't remember or don't know that lots of those islands have only been part of Japan for short periods of time. And the whole concept of what Japan is a relatively modern idea. And in specific terms, Okinawa, I think maybe a lot of people realize, was only sort of formally incorporated into Japan through annexation in 1879. But even Hokkaido was only incorporated into Japan in 1869. And before that, it's not Japanese, or at least there's a lot of debate about whether it falls into, the Tokugawa realm or not. Parts of it are inhabited by what we would today call Japanese people, but most of it wasn't. Anyway, so this process of how kind of the modern nation, the actual geography of the modern nation comes to be, I think is really true in Japan too, even though from the outside, it's oh, it's a bunch of islands. Surely it's always just been those islands. And Japan has kind of existed for thousands of years as this same thing. So that's a point that I think is really important to remember, and it's something I try and teach my students, but it always sort of surprises them. And then the corollary to that, of course, is, well, if all the parts that are in Japan today were not always in Japan before, what happens, who lived in those parts? And it's well, lots of different people lived in those parts. And you start opening up these conversations about how, the Japanese is also a category that today everyone thinks of as a very homogenous category, that, Japan is 98% Japanese, but that masks a lot of regional differences. It masks, indigenous populations in northern Japan, but also in the Ogasawaras, also in, the Okinawan Islands, and also in the parts of Japan that are even, today are not part of Japan, but used to be part of Japan, like Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Those people were Japanese for a while, but now they're not. So anyway, there's all this fluidity in who the Japanese people are that I think is also, really important to kind of think about historically, how those definitions have changed over time. But that also surprises students, I think, who are used to thinking of Japan as this very kind of homogenous space. And then, of course, I think, well, you and I can probably both appreciate this on a personal level. Our lived experience growing up in Japan was one where we were always wrestling with these definitions and these questions of well, we live here. I mean, you have a Japanese parent. I was also born in Japan. Do I count as a Japanese person? no, but it's home. Like, how do I wrestle with those questions? And I think it's something that a lot of international students or international school students in Japan, thought about a lot. So for those students, for people who come from like an international school background, these questions of like how identities change are a bit more natural, and they kind of are attracted to that. But for students who grew up in the US or grew up in one particular culture their whole lives, I think it's quite jarring, and it makes them think about their own societies and their own, own place in the world too. So that's my plug for studying Japanese history, I guess. But but I think it's something that's really interesting and really speaks to me both personally and intellectually. So I've been enjoying kind of studying Japanese history from the perspective of Hokkaido in that case. But
yeah, that concept of identity, I feel like, is a reoccurring theme, especially on this podcast. And I think that's a good segue into, what we were talking about a bit earlier about the original TCK, or your third culture kid. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, does your background of being someone who's raised in Japan, again, kind of this insider outsider thing, right? Where you're clearly on the inside, having lived so many years there, but you also have a lens, I think that's different than, someone who's half Japanese or full Japanese. So how has that affected your work when it comes to studying Japanese history? And then I guess at a larger scale, how has that affected your life in general, your outlook of the world operates?
Oh, I'm glad you're asking such easy and simple questions, Nikki, that I can answer in, just a few seconds. Yeah, I think that's, the short answer is that I still think about this a lot, and I don't have a good a good answer to this question. And, I was with my family last Christmas, and my sisters, all of whom also grew up like me, born in Japan and raised there, but not ethnically Japanese. Like, we all agreed, and we all shared this feeling of still kind of wrestling with like, Japan is home. Like, but what does it mean to be home from a place that now no one lives there? None of our parents live there. We don't have relatives there. We aren't ethnically part of this country. We don't have citizenship, but we still feel more attached and more rooted in home, and at home in Japan than we do anywhere else. So, on a personal level, to start with that, like, it is something that I think about a lot. And I think about, what if I never moved back to Japan, if I never lived there again, like, how would this part of my identity change? And like, what does it mean? And how do you even explain it to people outside of Japan? So it's a thing that I think about a lot, but don't have a good solution or a good sort of response to. I think it's on the whole a positive thing, despite the occasional like bouts of, where do I belong anxiety. I think it, all the sort of glib ASIJ slogan words about being a good global citizen and, becoming empathetic and understanding other cultures and all of that. I think it's real. I really do. I really think that it makes me interested and curious about people who've grown up in all sorts of different places. And I think I hope at least that's maybe a more empathetic person in my kind of day-to-day life. And I think that's really valuable. In a professional sense, obviously it connects really well to my work. Even though I didn't grow up speaking Japanese natively, having exposure to it all through childhood, including through such wonderful teachers as your father back in middle school. But, just having that childhood exposure to Japanese, it has been an enormous advantage. And obviously I've continued that study now, but, there's a big difference, I think, between picking up the language starting in college and just having a little bit more of a natural awareness and kind of comfort in it. And it means that when I do go to a place like Mito, I can have a conversation with people, I can give lectures, I feel comfortable in Japan in a way that allows me to like just focus on my research. Whereas I think for many of my colleagues, they still feel a little ill at ease when they're just kind of trying to manage their daily life in Japan. And that adds an extra level of stress, which I don't feel at all. Like the moment I get off the plane at Narita, it's like, oh, thank God I'm home. I'm going to go buy myself an onigiri and some green tea and like get on the train. And that's very comforting. And so that's been really helpful from kind of a work perspective. On the flip side, like studying Japan and Japanese history, but Japan professionally has maybe become a lot more kind of self-aware and a lot more critical, not just in a negative sense, but, kind of more critically aware of what our upbringing actually meant, like in a historical sense. Like, why was there this bunch of Americans hanging out in Tama. Why was ASIJ there for so, why have these international schools been in Tokyo for over 100 years? Like, what's that context? What's the relationship to imperialism and militarism and the occupation and, US-Japan relations and the Cold War, all these things that I think has made me become a little bit more humble about this kind of magic world of the international school community, like that fits into these broader social and cultural contexts that are worth exploring and worth thinking about. Anyway, so it kind of goes both ways, and I've been very lucky, I guess, in that my professional life has kind of afforded me the opportunity to kind of reflect on my personal upbringing and personal life, and then vice versa, have that I think enrich my professional life in turn. So
yeah, that's great to hear, like that you still think about it, because that seems to be what everyone. I guess maybe you do. Maybe you would have a problem if you weren't thinking about it. At some point you're like, I'm this, and then like you don't delve sort of into that intra perspective things about yourself. Digging in a little deeper, you used the word empathy earlier, and it sort of lighted a light bulb in my head or mind, about however you say it. This is a take I want to get from you. Is I feel like, at least from being someone who's half Japanese, so again, I also kind of, I'm not fully on the inside, you know what I mean, and you know how it is in Japan, a very homogeneous country. It's sort of like a Jun Yonjin, right? You're not true Japanese. But I feel like on the flip side, I don't want to say it's the opposite of empathy, but I feel like it has provided me ways of looking at the US and Japan in very dispassionate ways. Mm-hmm. So like I just don't get swayed so easily. So like someone could say stuff about Japanese internment in California, or whether or not the nuclear bombs Nagasaki, Hiroshima are good or bad. And I feel like with most other people I've spoken to, whether it's the massacre in Turkey with Turks, or what transpired in East Asia, for anyone who lives in East Asia, I feel like there's almost this like emotional trigger that basically makes people less analytical, and it's understandable, right? Anyone can get emotionally triggered by anything, but I don't know, in that sense I feel like, and I don't know if it's my personality, but I'm a bit more dispassionate. I was wondering, you sort of not being Japanese ethnic, if you sometimes feel like that distance helps you analyze more from the outside.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. But I would also say that that's true coming here, being in the US or being in the UK, like my citizenship or my ethnicity I don't think that matters so much to me as just the kind of growing up in this in-between space, which I do think like has made me more, that same kind of what I was describing before, of feeling like, oh, I can kind of bring this critical perspective to where I grew up as a result of sort of my studies, but also I think that extends to not being, kind of on the in of anywhere. Like, yeah, that distance means I bring a kind of a critical perspective to wherever I am. The sort of first big fight I had with my boyfriend was about very much this topic, where we got into this huge argument because I didn't know who James Brown was, and he's like, how can you call yourself an American? This is like a crucial part of American identity, and how dare you suggest that like you can be an American person and not have this cultural knowledge, and blah blah blah, blah. Anyway, we might have been a few drinks in at that point, so I'm not saying it was the most logical and sensible fight, but one of the points he made is like, Michael, you treat everything like this analytical object. Like, why don't you feel this sense of attachment to this place? Like, you live here now, and it's home, and it's my home, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I won't bore everyone with the details, but I do think it's kind of true. And I think that on the one hand, I feel like it's a strength of mine, but I think there's a small part of me that like wishes, and always has wished since I was a kid, that I kind of fit in a bit more somewhere. And that kind of comes back to the point I was making about my sisters and I talking about this last Christmas, where we have these rich lives and friends and partners and family, but there's always still a part of us that doesn't feel like we quite belong. And so yeah, I do think it's a strength, but it does come with this kind of flip side. And maybe there's a world where a little bit more emotional attachment is a good thing, or at least or at least recognizing that for many people, emotional attachments are real and meaningful, and not everything can or should be reduced to a bunch of algorithms or a bunch of objective analyses. Having just lived through this election here in the US, not to get too much into the politics, I think one of the clear takeaways is that a bunch of Ivy League academic people sitting around analyzing what American people want maybe isn't the thing that most people are thinking about, or the way most people are thinking about it. So, that's been kind of a humbling experience in other ways, I suppose. So I don't know. That's kind of a bit of a word salad I've just given you, but the short answer, yes, I do think about these kind of the distance, or like the clarity, but also some of the negative sides of that distance that come with kind of growing up in this in-between space.
Yeah, that's no. You gave me it was a good salad. It was a word salad, but it was a good.
Okay. You can edit out the bits that don't make sense.
No, I thought you actually brought up a great point. It made me just think about my own background too, right? You were saying sometimes it does almost seem like it's easier. Like I just think of and this is maybe why I like sports so much. Is at least in sports, it's very simple, right? Like we grew up in Japan, and it reminds me of, do you ever get the question where people go, so where's your real home, Michael?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like and you said it's hard to answer in one word, but it would be easier if you could just be like, oh yeah, my mom and dad are from Croatia, and Croatia's now, I guess Croatia's not a good example because they haven't been around as long, but maybe like somewhere else, like it's been around longer. And I was just thinking about how I always get the question, so who do you root for, Japan versus the US? And fortunately, neither team is very good at soccer, at least like globally.
Right.
So that's never been a big issue. Yeah. But in 2011, if you remember this, the finals of the World Cup was Japan versus the US. Yeah, with women's. That's right. I remember that was the first time. It was easy though in that case because one was a clear underdog. So I'm with underdog. Again,
I assume most of the people we've had on this program have said some version of this, right? Like even people, I'm thinking about a lot of my friends who I'm still in touch with from ASIJ, who might have both parents were Japanese, right? Or like you had one parent or whatever. But even the ones who, both parents are Japanese, born and raised in Japan, but then they left and went to, the US for college or whatever, or even just having had the experience of being at ASIJ for a while, they didn't feel like they fit in to the Japanese workplace or with their Japanese family members or whatever. I mean, I think that, there is something people, the kind of unmooring that an international education gives is a powerful thing, but it has these, it requires like a fair bit of maturity and a fair bit of being willing to like confront that uneasiness, I think, for people to be sort of happy and successful. And it takes a lot of people a long time to figure that out. Most people seem to figure it out, but sometimes it's not so easy. And especially like right now, it's, even on a very simple level of like, I just can't see half my family because oops, coronavirus happened. And turns out that expecting to be able to fly 18 hours across the world, maybe that wasn't a great assumption, and it's fine. But there are these kind of unintended side or consequences, I guess. It's not really a consequence, but just these like aspects of this life that I've been thinking about a lot more.
No, I agree with you. I would say consequence is not being over dramatic. I mean, it's there's always these positives and negatives, right? You have on one hand people that really straddle the fence per se, like you and I, or like going to the US, going to Japan, like in your case back and forth. In my case, I'm teaching at an American school, but I'm also constantly I'm still immersed in Japanese culture. But then you get other people who is to kind of choose a side almost, if that makes sense. That sounds horrible, but you see it, right? You see people that just they settle down, they go maybe to the States for college, and that's it. They'll stay in the States for another 40 years, and and they're happy. But there's also kind of that part of me that's thinking as an international citizen that does seem good, but it also seems like I would really miss Japan if I did that.
Yeah, and I think we're both very privileged in that sense, right? We can afford to have these lives. We don't have the tethers of children or anything right now, and we both come from countries and have the backgrounds where it is normal and expected and affordable to travel. And so I don't mean to, cry too much about it. I think I just sense that the world is entering an age where internationalism is like not totally welcomed by everyone or not seen as a great thing. Thinking about, to circle back to what you were saying before about how people, for a lot of people, like having these emotional ties to places is really valuable. And there are still a lot of people who are suspicious people who don't have those ties. And I, there's a very small part of me that worries in a world where, internationalism is seen as less and less of a good thing. Do our lives become a little harder or just a little less of a thing to celebrate, or maybe more honestly, a thing that to be a bit more kind of self-aware of and self-reflective about, like, what is it about this life and these experiences that are valuable, and what is it that is not, and how do we kind of assess those things or balance those things, and not be an arrogant ass about like parading our wonderful international experiences to everyone who maybe didn't have the fortune to have those, but also not giving in and saying like, oh, it's like, yeah, let me pretend that I didn't have this weird thing. Like you asked what the one word answer to home is. I do now just tell people, oh, I'm from Tokyo. And then people are like, some of them are like, what does that mean? I'm like, that's where I'm from. And then other people are like, oh, that's great. And just totally move on. And I can't tell which of those answers I think is worse. But, I think I don't feel like the need to apologize or defend it. Anyway, we've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole. Sorry.
Sorry. I think I took you down that rabbit hole. So I'm sort of pulling us back and reeling us back into history. And first of all, great. I probably should have said this like 40 minutes ago, but last time we actually met in person was some years back, and you didn't have your doctorate then. Now you are Dr. Thornton. So congratulations.
Thank you.
On your doctorate from I think it's a tiny school called Harvard. Some people may.
Yeah, it's up in the Northeast.
Right, and you're actually not the first doctor too in your family, right? You're saying you're the third.
That's right. My sister beat me to it. Well, my dad, of course, was Dr. T for the ASIJ crowd. So then my sister Gwen
too.
So
I guess it's not too much of a big deal in the Thornton family, but I think it is a big deal overall.
It was a big deal for me. I'm so happy to finish that degree.
And your doctoral thesis, right, was on, and I got the exact title through Yale's website with your profile on it, is Settling Sapporo, City and State in the Global 19th Century. I was curious.
Totally a bestseller. Just you wait.
I'm excited, man, to hear more about this, because also, earlier you're mentioning indigenous people, Hokkaido. I'm assuming you're talking about the Ainu. Why Sapporo? Why not our beautiful city of Tokyo? Right? I'm a little angry, actually. It's Tokyo Alumni Podcast. It's not Sapporo Alumni Podcast.
You don't have anyone from Hokkaido International School?
I want to one day. Maybe you can get me the hookup. But yeah, I was wondering. Why Sapporo? And I was gonna ask why 1800s, but I think that's kind of self-explanatory. So why Sapporo?
Went into grad school wanting to study and kind of work on the history of cities in Japan, urbanization, urban planning, urban society. When I went in, I didn't have a specific city in mind, but having grown up in Tokyo and loving Tokyo, and it's my favorite city, and I just think it's this like fascinating urban place that has a lot to offer the world in terms of lessons from history, but also contemporary practices and stuff. Anyway, so I went in kind of thinking about wanting to study more about Japanese cities. And particularly I was interested in, okay, what happens to Japan? We think of the Tokugawa period as being this era of Japanese cities, kind of ukiyo-e and like the floating world culture. And Japan has some of the world's biggest cities from as early as the 17th century. So that's like we know a lot about that. And that's kind of a very common image. And then of course, in the 20th century or modern times, Japan also has some of the world's biggest cities, Tokyo being the obvious one, but lots and lots of cities in Japan are very, very big and industrialized and give birth to kind of labor movements and new technologies and the train, all this stuff that we now associate with modernity is really, Japan is the first place outside the West to develop a lot of these things. And so it's very interesting. So then the question is like, well, what happens in between? Like, how do we go from the kind of Tokugawa era, like the castle town and the, brothel quarters and the samurai and the townspeople and stuff, to these modern cities. And it turns out that because of the way history is usually studied in Japan, a lot of people do like early modern history, kinseishi, and a lot of people do modern history or contemporary history, kindaishi or gendaishi, but not a lot of people do the kind of in-between bits or like the transition between the two. So there was a bit of an opening there. And then it turns out, to get back to your why Sapporo question, that of all Japan's sort of largest cities, Sapporo is the one that is actually founded in 1869. To my mind, it was like, wow, okay, here's the perfect place of all these people who, what they know about cities are the cities they grew up in, right? These Tokugawa era castle towns. It's now the second year of the Meiji period. They're in Hokkaido and they have to build a new city. So they're going to take these old ideas, but they're in this new world. And so what are they building, and how do they take those ideas, put them onto paper and then onto the ground? And then how does that change over the course of the Meiji period into what we would now think of as a very modern city? So I think Sapporo, so we have all these like documents and records and maps and stuff from the very earliest days of the city. So we can kind of see how people were thinking about cities and how those ideas were changing, like literally from the beginning of this city. So I think it's a really compelling place to study those ideas about city building and kind of how those ideas were changing in the Meiji period. And then, of course, the more I started looking at it, I realized just how important the question of colonization and imperialism was. Like Sapporo was built to enable Japan to colonize Hokkaido and the wider kind of Okhotsk region, right? Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. And Sapporo today, it's Japan's fifth biggest city. And that is in large part because it was this colonial capital. It was this hub that sort of hoovered in all these resources and coordinated this really large and very rapid colonial project in the second or the last third of the 19th century in Hokkaido. So anyway, then it turns out that so that kind of connection between imperialism and urbanization became really interesting, and that was sort of the main line that I pursued as I developed the thesis. Now, and it then turns out that this is happening at the same time in sort of global history terms or world history terms as the development of cities like Chicago or Melbourne in Australia, Denver, a lot of kind of the American Western cities. They're all being founded in the middle of the 19th century as these countries are, Australia, Canada, the United States are embarking on these like huge colonial projects, settler colonialism all across the American West. And so Sapporo's history then becomes part of this global history. And it turns out that it's not an accident. You've got all these people sort of studying other parts of the world. You have these foreigners coming to Sapporo and importing a lot of those ideas. So in addition to this sort of Japanese connection between city building and empire, you also have this connection between Japan and the wider world and this kind of global moment of really rapid settler colonialism. And putting Sapporo into that story is a good reminder that, Japan is not a latecomer to this story of empire. It's like right there from the beginning of modern Japan, this involvement in imperialism. Anyway, I can go on at great length, but that's at least three reasons why I think Sapporo is interesting.
Well, you mentioned something about, the sort of this blueprint of the city, right? There's still documentation available and how it's utilized for colonization. When this project embarked, was it backed heavily by the United States or other foreign powers, or like were they trying to emulate basically an existing city, or was there sort of a unique Japanese twist to it? Did the Japanese government sort of have quite a bit of oversight and control over how the city was going to be built?
So it's entirely a Japanese project, and actually the first plans for building a city are from the 1830s, so well before the United States or anyone is involved. Japan is actually mostly worried about Russia at this point being a kind of imperial or a colonial threat, a military threat from the north. But then after the Meiji period, when the Japanese government does start hiring all these foreigners to advise them, they do hire a bunch of Americans to come into Hokkaido and help with, they set up the university, probably like William Clark and his boys be ambitious is still sort of a slogan that people associate with Sapporo, because he's one of the first presidents for what is now Hokkaido University. So there's all these like famous Americans who come. And so I think a lot of people, including a lot of Japanese people, when they think of Sapporo, they think of Hokkaido, they think, oh, it's like an American kind of city. It's this grid system with wide avenues and all the streets are numbered and whatever. And to some extent, like, yes, there was an American influence there, but all of the layout of the streets was actually based on Kyoto, right? I mean, it's this ancient idea of kind of classical Chinese capital layouts. And then I don't know if you've spent any time in Sapporo, but you have this division between sort of the like government side of the city in the north, and then the kind of commoner side of the city in the south, which is today Susukino, which is one of the big like red light, well, sort of entertainment districts in Sapporo. And that's a layout that it's not just Kyoto, but also a very typical castle town layout. So in some ways, I think it's better to think of Sapporo as like the last Japanese castle town rather than the first modern Japanese city. The more I've sort of studied it, the more I've realized that, you know, the ideas that are funneling into Sapporo and into Hokkaido are ideas that come from the Tokugawa period. And then on top of that, the ideas that are coming in from the West, it's not so much the Japanese or the like US government as, you know, they're bringing in sort of industrial technology. So they introduce new forms of agriculture, coal mining, lumber, you know, all these sort of resource extraction technologies that the Japanese government is keen to use to sort of jumpstart the, you know, colonization, or sort of secure their hold over Hokkaido as part of the colonization process. So yes, there is some hybridity there, but I do think I always like push back on people who are like, oh yeah, Sapporo, it's so American. I'm like, well, no, it's just like, it's like the planners had a blank slate. Every other city, like, you couldn't impose your will onto Edo because it had been around for 450 years, right? So it's this like layer after layer after layer of stuff. But Sapporo, there was, you know, there are like 3 Ainu villages in the area. But aside from that, there's a lot of space to just build the city, and then the Ainu eventually get kicked out, and sort of they're you know no longer in the city after the first 10 years or so. So by then, it literally is like a very Japanese city, and the Japanese state, which is controlling it, can do whatever they want.
I was actually under definitely that misunderstanding that I really viewed it too as sort of this American project, but I guess you're saying it's autonomously Japanese, at least in the beginning. And even, you know, later on, it was just by the time the Americans have sort of joined the project, it was already once the general blueprint of the city was set.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe I have that association because I guess Japan and Russia go to war, right, about 30 years after that. So I've always sort of associated that city with that. And I imagine that also, kind of like Mito, must have taken you to Hokkaido a few times.
Was there a few times. I actually lived there for a year. I had a Fulbright scholarship, which sent me to Hokkaido for a year. Have been back, you know, for summers and shorter trips as well. It was great. I love Sapporo. I think it's really a great city, and it was actually really nice to live there for a year. I flew down to Tokyo a fair bit, but it's such a, you know, it has a totally different history, and it's a totally different part of the country, and just people. It was a good reminder, or it was a good place to learn about how, like, coming back to what we were talking about at the beginning of, you know, the session, like what it means to be Japanese looks very different depending on where you are, or where you grew up, or where you live. And Sapporo is certainly a good example of that.
All right, so I want to switch gears a bit, and I mean, this might be going in a totally different direction, but
I spend enough time thinking about my history work, so anything else is fine.
That's true. We've been very history TCK sort of centric. But yeah, I want to get into running a bit. And I actually want to preface it a bit with, you know, our relationship in regards to running. So for people who aren't aware, we ran together 3 years in high school.
Yeah.
We were, you know, co-captains, right, senior and junior year. So you're younger than me. A point I actually wanted to touch upon, and I don't know if you've thought much about this, but you know, as a high school coach myself in middle school, with sports, people develop differently, right? Especially at that age, like especially because kids physically grow, right? Some kids will play basketball; they're 5'6" 1 year, and they're 6 foot the next year, like literally, right? Which is unthinkable for us old guys, right? To grow 6 inches, but.
Shrinking these days.
We're just trying to maintain, right? But with you, I actually have this vivid memory of we ran a bit in middle school as well, and you were I think like the slowest one, like not even on the team, maybe in the league. And then you came up to high school.
I think that's very possible.
Yeah, and and then you came up to high school and you were kind of more like in the medium level. I was thinking, okay, I kind of remember him. Like I thought he was slower. And then by the time sophomore, junior year came, you were one of the better, if not one of the best, in the whole league. It intrigues me, right? Cross country, because sure, people get better in basketball, they get better at soccer, there's range, but cross country and track, especially long distance, is the only field where I can see someone going from literally, I don't know how many, we had maybe 50 runners, you were number 50, to go, like to 3-4 years later being captain of the team of, one of the best cross country teams in Asia, with, one of the best, race times. So I was wondering just how self-aware you were of how much you improved. And like, what is it about running? Like, do you think this improvement you made massively in 3, 4, 5 years? I didn't see what was happening behind the scenes, but was that something you were very conscious about, that you wanted to get to a certain level, or is it just you kept running?
Yeah, that's I mean, thank you for bringing up all these suppressed memories, Nikki. My most humiliating memory of running was actually not cross country, but track in 6th grade, where I ran the 800 and got lapped by it was like some combined middle school, high school race, and some very speedy Kinnick runner, like basically crossed the finish line as I was going around the first lap. So yeah, it was a rough start to my running career all around. But I don't know. I mean, I think first of all, like cross country is one of my it's like one of the most powerful memories I have of school, and I think it's become more powerful the longer I've been away. Like I just am so grateful first to my dad for forcing me to do it in 6th grade. Or well, he said I could pick what sport I wanted to do, but the other option was soccer, and my hand-eye coordination would have made it even more embarrassing than cross country was. So cross country it was. But then like middle school cross country was sort of a whoever wants to come can do it. Mike Bjornholm and Marty Swist were very patient and sort of kind coaches. And so it was a very comfortable environment. But then once I started, that first year was sort of I had no idea what to even expect. But there's something so satisfying about cross country, because like every week you're doing the exact same race. Especially for us, because we didn't even move around that to different courses very often. So it was so easy to track your improvement. And so you had a very like obvious attainable goal. And there was also a pretty obvious attainable like set of inputs. It's like, okay, you just have to put on more miles. And you have to like try and go a little bit faster each week for the speed workout. And you have to do a little bit more, maybe do one more like mile on the long run or something. And, middle school, that wasn't really, like, I don't think I was thinking about that at all in middle school. But then getting into high school, certainly I had some senpai who were way better runners than I was. And so looking up to you guys and kind of being pushed that way, I thought the team, I really loved the fact that it was a collaborative and supportive team, right? Like we were competitive, but not, I never felt people were putting each other down in a way that was dispiriting, and I hope that didn't happen to people younger than me. I think that one thing I really pride ourselves on as a cross-country team was just how kind of supportive that was. And so I think that really, like being comfortable and confident is really important. I think that was really important for me too. Like I don't think of myself as a natural athlete, or I certainly didn't when I was in school. But now I think of running as like a really important part of my life. I've had this stupid injury the last little while, so I haven't been running that much. But I ended up running a marathon when I was living in Sapporo, and that was really great. I ended up helping out the coaches and the high school cross country team at ASIJ when I was back in Japan for a year, which was really, really fun. And I'm really grateful to Steve Welkley and Suzuki Sensei for letting me do that. And it was just great. It was like so much fun to run with, the guys on the team. They're way faster than we were, I have to say. The team has gotten much speedier, but there's still kind of that heart there, I think, of, it's like, these are like good kids, and the sport, it's such a grueling sport. And like, there's not really, I don't know, maybe there's not really the time and space to be like horrible to your teammates. So maybe that helps too. But yeah, I don't know. So I think, it's a funny sport, right? Like I have this very strong memory of it. The thing I miss the most about it is actually the team part of it, even though you never really think of cross country as a team sport if you've never done it. But I thought we had like great teams when we were in school, and that was, it just really stands out as a positive thing.
It's interesting how you mentioned that sixth grade race, and how, this is something I bring up a lot to, coaches who are new to any of the programs I do. So I do middle school and high school soccer. But there's, I feel like sometimes people just don't take it seriously enough. And
the coaches, you mean?
Yeah, coaches, because people are busy, right? They got their kids to look after. They have their their actual subjects they teach, etc.
Right.
But it's like some of these memories are so strong, and they affect the rest of your life. You said you can still remember getting lapped in that sixth grade race by the Kinnick boy. Who I guess it was maybe middle school, high school combined race, which maybe led to that as well. But yeah, that's why I, at least at a personal level, I try to really put my heart and soul into it, because I feel like kids do remember the good and the bad, and it helps them develop as they get older. And you mentioned also the really interesting point about cross country is a team sport. Yeah, I was actually just thinking of that the other day. As from my classroom, I can see the finish line, because they run within the GC, and I even after the fastest kids finish, they're still rooting on the slower kids until the very last kid comes in, and then everyone got together. Maybe not the best during coronavirus, but it was it's Korea, so we don't have
Right, you guys are fine. I if I could run on a cross country team again, I would. Sadly, it's a little harder in New York City.
No, it's different too, being adults, right? If you don't have that sort of, there was definitely, as you said, that spirit and that connection that I'm very happy I was able to be part of that for 4 years, and 3 years we did that together. So that's pretty awesome.
I do think it feeds into a sort of personality trait too, though, right? Where it's just okay, I do have this kind of obsessive personality. It's a thing that allowed me to finish a PhD, but also running is it's okay, I have to put in all these miles this week for my long run, or I'm training for these races. I just have to go out and do all this stuff, and it's kind of boring and monotonous and repetitive, but I will do it, because if I don't do it, I will have been a failure. So there's a lot of internalized personal sort of what's the word? I don't know. It's like a self-testing mechanism. So maybe there's a little bit of a problem in there somewhere. But
it's a problem, but I think it's a blessing that, right? It's not like, let's say, basketball where you're 6'8", and it's oh, okay, you're 6'8", so you're probably going to be good. It's like with running. You said this. You were saying it impacts you more today. I was wondering maybe if you could follow up on that. And before that, I just want to quickly put in my 10 seconds. I think about it all the time now with there's sometimes this perspective in education where people just sort of write it off as, oh, they're kids. And so it's okay that, they're not doing this and that. But then I think of, Scott Metz, right, who we both ran with for 2, you might have ran all 4 years with him. And I vividly recall him checking his own miles with his own watch, making sure that his mile times and second mile times were there. And because he was a wrestler, he would also talk to me a bit about, weight control and weight management. And I had no idea about any of this stuff. And it totally just revolutionized the way I looked at running, and just the way I looked at self-control. Sure, I still ate McDonald's and stuff because, I was 17. I had good metabolism, but he impacted me for the rest of my life in regards to how I look at athletics and how I look at, self-control. Because he was just, skinny white kid, just with his little clock and not clock, watch, and But anyways, I was wondering when you were saying earlier it affects you now more. I was wondering if you could elaborate.
Well, I think part of the reason is that I became a more serious runner after college. I didn't really run that much in college, but then sort of going to grad school, well, being back in Japan and then going to grad school, like I got back into running, and then I started taking it like way more seriously. And so sort of, at that point, look back kind of on my cross country experience in high school and was like, oh wow, okay, yeah, I ran hard, but I didn't like really train. And like now I see, I should be like building these mileage programs and like thinking about times and schedules and like race patterns and all this stuff. And I got really into it. And again, like I'm not like a world-class runner by any means at all, but I was like happy with sort of aiming for times that I felt good about and really kind of enjoyed it. And so the more I got back into running and like taking it seriously, the more I was grateful for just it's just a lot easier to fall back into habits of training and practice and stuff like that. And so having had that experience in high school was really meaningful. But then just like, I don't know, on a more kind of abstract level, it really does feel like a skill that, or a mindset or a sort of attitude that will stick with me for life, right? Partly I really miss running right now because my stupid leg hurts, and I miss being out kind of putting miles in, and I miss the camaraderie of the running team and stuff like that. And that just, the other parts of high school have sort of drifted away a little bit. I don't, I'm not that close with very many friends from high school anymore. The subject matter of the classes I've kind of forgotten, but I think because running was always sort of a personal thing, or like it was a habit building exercise as much as, like I don't remember any of the specific races particularly, but because it's this habit and because it's this sort of mindset that I think has stuck with me and that I am still using every day, the connection to my sort of high school years is still very strong, and maybe a little stronger than some of the other things that I remember from school. I don't know if I have anything more profound than that to say about it.
Yeah, speaking of mindset, have you ever read that book by Haruki Murakami, where it talks
about when I think about running?
Yes, that one.
Yeah.
Because I was wondering, you're a pretty deep thinker, and is that the type of stuff that goes through your head? Like, are you always thinking pretty deeply, or do you try to just go into Zen mode?
It's like I hate running to music. I don't have anything in my ears. I like, my boyfriend just started running, and he can only run with music or like a podcast or something, and he doesn't get it at all. And I used to think like, oh, it's a great time to go like think about stuff, and sometimes I do. But honestly, like I can like do a long run and just like be counting steps for huge portions of it, or like thinking about my breathing and like thinking about my form and thinking about, I guess the short answer, it's like a bit more like Zen mode. Having said that, I don't think I've ever had a runner's high. Like it doesn't always feel like I'm just, switching off. Like it feels hard a lot, even when I'm in shape.
I 100% agree with that. I think it's a lie. I've never felt good.
Yeah. Like I felt good after running, but I've never really felt good while I'm running. There are a couple of exceptions to that. And actually, like Murakami, a lot of his, he was in Cambridge for a while in Massachusetts and did these laps around the Charles River. And of course, when I was at Harvard, like I was also running these laps around the Charles River. So people were asking me all the time, like, oh, is this where Murakami ran? I'm like, I don't know, but probably. But some of my best runs were in like February in Boston, running along the Charles, and like doing like 10 milers or something. So not like crazy long, but long enough. And it's icy, and there's like the wind off the river, and there's no one out there except for like one or two other stupid runners, right? And it's great, and you're just like all alone, and you can like wave to the other runners, and they wave back, and you're just like covered in ice. And a couple of those runs, which I did as tempo runs, and like you speed up towards the end, and it comes pretty close to what I imagine a runner's high would feel like. But then like you think, oh, I'm covered in ice and snow, and it's freezing, and it's dark, and I'm like, well, this is not that fun. So never quite got to that euphoric state, but maybe I can imagine what it would be like, and I'll have to keep trying.
That sounds crazy, man. But it's good to hear that there's other people out there that run who don't feel the joy when people are like, oh, I love running. Switching gears, love life. You've been together now with boyfriend John for I think you said 5 years on a messenger thing, but I think 4 to 5 years. Is that correct?
Yes, it'll be 5 in February, I'm reminded.
So approaching 5 years. And
Approaching 5.
yeah, when it comes to love life, for you, growing up, when I knew you in high school, you weren't out.
Yeah.
And how has that transition been in regards to just going from, the international school to the States, as well as just this world we live in, right? Like, obviously things are better, right? They're not great,
Yeah.
but better significantly. And I'm wondering, how has your life been, especially as a young man, like witnessing, basically states going from illegal to legal, in your 20s?
Yeah, well, to the first part of the question about, moving from kind of Japan or international school to the States, I mean, like the moment I hit the ground in college, I was out. So it wasn't like a surprise or a long process particularly. It took a little longer to sort of come out to my family. And even to this day, I find it quite difficult in Japan to know, frankly, just how to come out to people. I mean, this is the thing about coming out, right? That you're like always doing it. And it gets easier, and in some cases it doesn't matter that much, but I just think that I've never felt unsafe or unwelcome in Japan, but I just like don't feel like I've ever understood or had any kind of role models or colleagues or peers or out friends in a Japanese context. So even at the very basic level of like the language, right? Like I don't even know like how to talk about being gay with like Japanese colleagues. Like, is that a thing that I should even mention? Like, how do I discuss my boyfriend? It feels weird not to discuss the boyfriend. But it also, anyway, so it also doesn't help that like a lot of my kind of casual Japanese is from when I was 16. And so I'm now 32. Like, can I use the same words as I used when I was 16 when talking? There's all these like layers that make it a bit complicated. And I think that, that was also true at ASIJ too, right? Like there weren't very many, if any, out people. It wasn't a place that felt particularly actively homophobic, but I also would not have called it a particularly welcoming environment. And so I think that it took it like in the years after graduating, like going back, because my parents are still working there, my sisters were still there, I still have friends at school. It was always a little bit hard to like negotiate. Okay, like who am I telling what to? But that's that phase of my life is over, and now there are no secrets. Well, there are other secrets, but no. I mean, I feel much more comfortable now, and I do think that being at college in the States, in the East Coast, like, it made it much easier. And so I was very lucky there. The other thing, like, yeah, to your broader point about the world, I mean, it's, I feel very fortunate. I mean, I feel like I was born at the right time, right? I don't know a world where people are still being actively persecuted in my community, right? In New York, in the United States. And so it's a little surreal to kind of watch like the Supreme Court justice nominations recently and various ballot measures and, people talking about like removing rights for transgender folks and stuff. It's a little weird because like our whole lives, I've always noted a sort of this kind of march of progress. And so that's a little bit jarring, but honestly, the bigger one for me, just speaking very personally, is less about kind of legal rights. And more it's been, sort of the huge progress being made against HIV/AIDS, right? And whether that's at the level of, just public health measures and being able to kind of, we've developed better cures and stuff, or with PrEP, right? As sort of medicine to sort of help people, gay men in particular, like manage their sex lives. Like, so much like gay films and art and music from the generation before us is about the AIDS crisis. And I feel like, my generation of gay men, our generation of people, like owes it to that earlier generation to know and understand and appreciate and mourn that period in our history. But at the same time, there's also this like burden that's been lifted, right? That like AIDS is still out there, HIV is still a serious disease, but for most people, it is no longer a death sentence, and for the gay community, it is no longer like the only thing that matters. And I think that is really a wonderful thing, and a thing that I think will, is worth celebrating, and has allowed for a flourishing of gay life, like outside of that really tragic period. And so I'm really, I'm grateful for that every day. I don't know if that, it's just like a thought that I had a lot.
I definitely, I hear the history nerd in you talking about,
the
90s. Because I was just watching. I apologize, I can't recall the documentary, but it was like an older gay guy, and he was just saying, I think it was one of those YouTube clips, like like pro-gay people talk to anti-gay people or something like that, and he was saying how, like, as you were saying, people just don't realize how bad it was in the 80s, 90s, which again is not. We're not talking about 100 years ago. We're not talking about 50 years ago. We're talking about guys that are still very much alive today. Where, if, there was a period where if you had, 10 gay friends, 5 are dead, in the span of 5 years because of AIDS. And then you have the 80s where, it wasn't uncommon for even a place like California for a bar to have a sign that says, no faggots allowed. Again, this is the 80s. This is not, the 1960s. Like, I said it's incredible how much progress. But as you said, there's this dichotomous world we live in. It's almost like a Black Mirror's episode, right? With the recent appointment to the Supreme Court justices, and it's kind of like, are we making progress, or are we, in certain ways back? But
anyway. I mean, I also think that one of the lessons from the AIDS crisis too is that a lot of people fought really, really hard to force, in this case, the U.S. government, but all across the world, to force people to pay attention and change the circumstances. And I think that's been true of a lot of, like, progress doesn't happen naturally, and that's now being very trite. But I feel that very strongly, that like we all have to fight for the things we believe in, and people believe in different things, and to some extent, that's okay. We all have our causes, and we don't all have to fight for all the causes. And I do think that one of the, just speaking personally, like as I've gotten a bit older and a bit more comfortable in being out in my own sexuality, I think for a while I went through a phase of saying, okay, well, yeah, I'm gay, but that's not the thing I want to talk about, or not the thing I care about, or I need to like broadcast it or make it a big deal. The things I care about are cities and urban issues and trains and transportation and whatever, housing policy. But I think that there is more and more of me now that says, no, like, I don't need to make everything I talk about be about gay rights or be about gay politics, but I do think that we owe, that we have some obligation and some responsibility to our communities, and we don't always get to choose the communities we're born into. And it's become more important for me to like recognize and support other folks who are fighting for, rights that I benefit from. And so I don't really know, right now that mostly looks like donating some money here and there and like helping out with some volunteer organizations in other places. I don't have any grand political program or anything like that to talk about, but I do think that being politically engaged, it doesn't just mean like the partisanship of like, am I a Democrat or am I a Republican, but it means like we all have to chip in to ensure that our democratic world survives. And that part of that means chipping into all the parts of that world that, matter a lot to you and to people you know and love and care about. And if we don't chip in, then the things erode or they disappear, or the things we fought for start to go away. I think I'm just trying to like keep that in mind, and as I sort of get older and think about what comes ahead, trying to be careful and proactive about fighting for things that I think are meaningful and important.
I think that's a beautiful way to sort of summarize it, and I think it's a good point for us to transition now to the closing. So at the end here, as we wrap up this podcast, I like to ask the guests what is coming up in their lives in the next few months, next few years, next few decades, even if you want to get ambitious. The mic is yours, Michael. Please tell us what's to come.
Well, as you kindly mentioned at the beginning, I've got these books, one of which is coming out in Japanese in the new year, and the English version probably a couple months after that. And then I'm working on this really cool, one of the book projects is this really cool guidebook to Tokyo that I'm doing with a bunch of colleagues here at Yale and at the University of Tokyo, at a couple Tokyo universities. So that's going to be the next couple of years, and I think that's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be able to hopefully travel to Japan again soon and explore all these neighborhoods. I'm really looking forward to getting back to Tokyo, and the purpose of the book is to explore it from kind of a bottom-up history perspective, the people's history of Tokyo, and I'm really looking forward to kind of digging into parts of the city that I don't know that well. So I'm hoping that will take me back to Japan a lot, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to meet up with old friends, make new ones in Tokyo, and this is probably a great audience to ask for any insights or any leads on organizations or people or places in Tokyo that you think are particularly compelling or interesting for a guidebook that you don't think make it into the Lonely Planet or whatever. I'd really love to hear about them. So I hope people will get in touch. Beyond that, I don't know. I'm here in New York for the foreseeable future, but if coronavirus has taught me anything, it's that maybe it's okay not to make too many firm plans. So kind of waiting to see what happens in terms of career and life beyond that, but looking forward to a vaccine and looking forward to being able to get out and explore the world a bit more again.
Awesome. I too am hoping to look, I don't know, I messed my words there. I'm looking forward to the vaccine as well. Yeah, and your book sounds awesome. I hope the research goes well. And yeah, definitely this would be the platform if anyone has any secret places that TripAdvisor or Lonely Planet doesn't know about. I guess that's your goal, huh? Is to really dig into that sort of non-mainstream areas. So that is the 48th episode of Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Thank you for coming, Michael Thornton. And we'll see you around sometime, somewhere when this coronavirus is over.
I hope so. Thanks so much for having me, Nick. This is really great.